now I would like to introduce Dub Crook, who will give our program tonight on the Archeology of Christmas. I never read appropriately Dub Crook's bio because I think everybody knows Dub Crook. So why do I need to tell you about him? But to end the year, I'm going to tell you about our Dub Crook. So Dub Crook is a longtime member of the Dallas, Houston, and Texas Archeological Societies. He retired after a distinguished 35-year career as a senior executive with ExxonMobil. He has traveled extensively, starting his adventures as a child. His father, Wilson W. Bill Crook Jr., was past president and fellow of the Texas Archeological Society and one of the pioneering researchers on archaeology of the Upper Trinity watershed. As a result of his father's lifelong interest in archaeology and paleoanthropology, Dub grew up going to and working on archaeological and early man sites around the world. Mr. Crook has published 251 professional papers, 251, 183 of them in the field of archaeology. While his archaeological research has focused primarily on the Upper Trinity River watershed, he has also worked on sites elsewhere in Texas, New Mexico, Nevada, California, and Virginia. He has also worked outside the US in the Rift Valley of East Africa, in South Africa, in South America, Bolivia, Argentina, and Peru, and in Kazakhstan. Mr. Crook received his Bachelor of Science degree in mineralogy in geology from Southern Methodist University and conducted his graduate studies in mineralogy and rare earth crystal chemistry at the University of Michigan. Besides his membership in the local archaeological societies, he's a member of the Center for the Studies of First Americans, the Archaeological Association of Virginia, a life member of the Galt School of Archaeological Research, a fellow of the Texas Archaeological Research Laboratory in Austin, and a fellow of the Leakey Foundation. Most recently, Dub has analyzed every single flake, core, point, tool, and firecracked rock from the Lone Oak site in Columbus, Texas, and has authored his report on phases 1 and 2, which should be in your hands in early 2021. So tonight, Dub will get us ready for the holiday season with a talk entitled The Archeology of Christmas. Dub Crook.
Okay. Let's see if I can't share this. Okay. What I want to do tonight is take you through something that I did several years ago. I was actually teaching a adult Sunday school class, and we were going through the Christmas story. And I was reading it, and especially out of the Gospel of Luke, and it dawned on me that there are an awful lot of facts that are given, people, places, names, things like this, that we could probably support with archaeology, especially discoveries that have been made over the last 2 decades. So I started putting together something that I just jokingly called the Archeology of Christmas, and it really began to come together. So I'm going to take you through what I went through, and that's basically looking at the gospel reading section by section as we go through the well-known Christmas story, and then seeing what archaeology has found to support the things that the gospel writers have written. You have to know that the 2 best stories come from the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. And Matthew was a man who spent 3 years wandering around Galilee and through Judea with Jesus. And then Luke himself, as a doctor, doctors in the 1st century AD, along with astrologers, were probably the highest form of science that there was. And he very diligently investigated all these claims of people who were telling him the story, because he hadn't been there like Matthew had been during the lifetime of Jesus on earth. These are people who put down what they saw, and not just hearsay of what they were told. In fact, You can see the quote I put there from Peter, that we did not follow cleverly invented stories when we told you about the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to run with it here, and we're going to break up the Christmas story into all of its sections, starting in Nazareth and then ending with the often forgotten part of the Christmas story, which is the Holy Family's flight to Egypt. This is a picture of the earliest manuscript of the Gospel of Luke that has survived. It dates to the 2nd century AD, but there were obviously earlier copies that we haven't survived. But Luke himself wrote that he carefully investigated everything from the beginning as it was handed down from those who were eyewitnesses. So this was a critical review. I mean, he was putting his name on this document. So he critically reviewed everything. And I think you'll join with me at the end and see how much of this has now been supported by new archaeology. All right, the story starts in Nazareth. And obviously it starts with the Annunciation to Mary in Nazareth. This is a photo of what modern Nazareth looks like. It's the largest Palestinian Arab city in all of Israel, over 100,000. You can see the pollution in the air and everything there, but a very vibrant city that just contains part of the story right in the middle of it. So the gospel story starts out and it says, in the 6th month, God sent an angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a town in Galilee, to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David. And the virgin's name was Mary. All right, so we have, Mary being in this town in Nazareth. Now, a common objection of biblical critics was that there was no Nazareth in existence during the 1st century AD. In fact, a man named Rene Salm wrote an entire book on it, The Myth of Nazareth, the invented town of Jesus. And he claimed that Nazareth didn't really even exist until the 2nd century AD. Well, up until the last 11 years, there's been really scant evidence for a 1st century Nazareth. But in the last 11 years, there has been new excavations and they have found several things. First of all, they found that Nazareth was actually founded in the late Bronze or the early Bronze Age around 2200 BC and was in existence to about the 8th century. Then it lay dormant until about the 1st century BC when it was reoccupied. And this has all been verified by pottery, which is fortunately very distinctive as it changes during over the centuries. But here in the last decade, there was always a church, well, I say always, it was built in 1969 called the Church of the Annunciation, Roman Catholic Church, and it was built over a one-room cave that had some Greek writing on the side of it that this was the original house of Mary. And so there was veneration of that site. There's a second church nearby called the Church of St. Joseph. And in between was kind of an open area that wasn't being utilized. So the Catholic Church decided in 2009 to open up the area between the two churches and add some additional buildings. Well, no sooner had they excavated than they began to find courtyard houses, and I will tell you more about them in a minute. But they found 2 1st century courtyard houses that were dated by both pottery, but especially by oil lamps. Oil lamps change style over time to the point that they never reused a style. And the so-called Herodian oil lamp style, which dates from about 40 BC up through 70 AD, is very distinctive with a flaring spout. And they found in these 2 courtyard houses Herodian oil lamps, as well as ceramics that date to the 1st century AD. And it turns out that one of the houses that they had found actually has some early Christian veneration as possibly the childhood home of Jesus, being the tradition was that it was apparently the home of Joseph. So after he married Mary. And then in just the last few years, there has been underneath a convent about half a block away, excavation there to expand the grounds of the convent. They also hit a 1st century AD house, as well as a street has been found. So I will show you these here now. Now, this is a stylistic model, if you will, of a Herodian period, 1st century AD courtyard house. You can see this is, well, let me say it's like I said, it's a stylistic model. Each one is slightly different, but they basically have a courtyard area that opens up into a living space with usually one room for sleeping, a room for storage, and then a large room that's known as a tracklin. Well, a tracklin just means the large room. And this is where people did eating. There were other household duties done, sewing, sometimes cooking, although most of the time cooking was done out in the open courtyard. And some of these houses were built over a cave structure, which could provide cold storage. You have to remember there is no refrigeration in the 1st century AD. So to keep things like wine or even meat, which was rare in the diet, but to keep it cool and preserve it, they would store these in these underground caves. So this is the house that has been excavated. It's built around these other buildings now, but it's mainly this back wall you can see of fairly well done masonry, and it's this is part of the courtyard house right in here. They believe that this is the house that may have been owned by Joseph. You know, we get down to our translations of Joseph being a carpenter. Well, in reality, in the Greek that was used, if he had been purely a woodworking carpenter, the word that would have been used is tekton zulon. But when describing Joseph, both Luke and Matthew only refer to him as a tekton, at which point that would come down to us as a general contractor. So he worked in stone, he worked in wood, he did just about everything that a general contractor would have done. And so this is the first house that they found. This is the second one that was found, and you can see the very thick, well-made walls here of the house. You can see the size of this person here, but you see the multiple rooms around in here. And this is the one that was found immediately adjacent to the Church of the Annunciation. And then here is the street that they found, and you can see Nazareth was a little bit of a backwater. Most estimates made by scholars say that Nazareth was on the order of about 480 people in the 1st century AD max. And probably it was more in the order of 250 to 300 people. So a relatively small city, but this would essentially have been the main street. And 1st century AD pottery was found all adjacent right in this area and here too when they found this street. Then the last one is this house that was found next to the convent here just a few years ago. And the feeling is because it is paved surface, not just dirt, and it has these large structures that would have been used for maybe food preparation or whatever. This is believed to have been the most upscale home in all of Nazareth. So like the person who was the mayor of Nazareth, not a Joseph or a Mary, probably lived in this house. But nonetheless, the bottom line is that Nazareth definitely was occupied during the 1st century AD, as the gospel says. Okay, the next part of the story then takes place on Bethlehem. Why did they go to Bethlehem? Well, the gospel tells us in those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that the census should be taken of the entire world. And this was the first census that took place when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And everyone went to his own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he was of the lineage of David. Now, in both Luke and in Matthew are the lineages given, in Matthew of Joseph and in Luke of Mary, and both descend from the line of King David. But what this verse tells us is, okay, we've got somebody named Augustus Caesar, and he issues a decree that a census be taken. Why? The Romans really only cared about that you were loyal and didn't revolt against them, but you could keep your own religion and your own society and everything as long as you faithfully paid taxes. So the census was not like we take it for representation, but was for taxes. And so that's the reason. And we hear this person, Quirinius, as governor of Syria, and then everybody going to their hometown. Well, the Romans, when they took a census, did not require people to go back to their hometown. That was a Jewish thing, that the Jews, whenever there was a census, they kept it by their ancestral home village. So in my case, if we had something like this, I would have to go back to University Park in Dallas and be there to be registered and taxed. And this is what Joseph is doing, but that's not a Roman thing. So people have said, they don't argue about Caesar Augustus, but this Quirinius never existed, and certainly he was never a governor and never issued any orders for taxation. Well, what it turns out is that the reason that people have not found a record of the taxation when it should have occurred is primarily because of a copying error of the famous Jewish historian, Roman Jewish historian, Flavius Josephus. And people have found that every copy of Josephus that was made after 1544 has this error in it, suggesting that Herod died in 4 BC. Therefore, the census had to be taken sometime before he died, like 5 or 6 BC, because Herod is still alive during the Christmas story. However, what's been found is that every copy of Josephus that dates before 1544 actually shows that Herod died near the time of a major lunar eclipse, which occurred on January 10, 1 BC, at which point the census would have occurred at 2 or 3 BC, not at 5 or 6. Now, there are Roman records, and I will show you this in a minute, that indicate that Quirinius was a real person. He held the titles of legate of Caesar in Syria and the prefect of the first Augustan cohort, and that a formal census did occur in the year 3 BC. We won't argue about Caesar Augustus. Obviously, there are many records of him, many statues. This is one from the Vatican, and there are literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of coins with his depiction on it. So definitely a real figure. Quirinius, however, there has been 2 inscriptions found in Antioch, Pisidia. Now, Antioch, Pisidia is in the southern part of modern-day Turkey. And the first one, which is pictured here, names Publius Sulpicius Quirinius as the chief magistrate for the Roman province of Syria. Well, that is exactly what the legate of Syria would have been. And so he had the ability to issue a decree for taxation and a census to be taken, and was actually responsible to Rome for this occurring. The second one that supports Quirinius is what's known as the Melias Secundus inscription. This was also found in Antioch, Pisidia recently, and it states that this fellow Aemilius Secundus was commanded by Quirinius to conduct a census in this town in Syria in the year 3 BC. And so what most scholars believe is that he didn't issue a single order that covered all of his territory, but that he issued a number of these to specific individuals who then would have carried them out in their sub-provinces within the overall Roman province of Syria. So Quirinius did exist, and there is evidence that in 3 BC, he did issue a general order for a census to be taken so that the whole province could then be taxed. The other argument that's put out about Bethlehem is that Bethlehem did not exist in the 1st century BC and not until about the 3rd or 4th century BC. But in reality, Bethlehem has been there for a long, long time. And recently in Jerusalem, this little clay seal known as a bulla has been found, and it dates from the time of King Hezekiah, so the late 8th century or early 7th century BC. And what it reads, and this is in Hebrew, so it reads from right to left, but it basically is saying it was on top of a shipment of grain and wine from Bethlehem to the king in Jerusalem as part of their taxes. So obviously Bethlehem existed back, 7 or 8 centuries before the 1st century AD, and was continuously occupied, as archaeology has now shown, all the way through to up into today. All right, the third part of the Christmas story has to do with Mary giving birth and the fact that there was no room for them in, quote, an inn. So it says, when they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. And she wrapped him in swaddling clothes and placed him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. All right, we've always heard this when we were children, no room at the inn. Well, there is a place in Bethlehem, a church of the Nativity, which was built in the 4th century AD over a small cave, which was purported to be the place where Jesus was born. The location was confirmed by an early Christian leader named Justin Martyr in 150 AD as the place for the Nativity. Now, interestingly, in describing it, if we go back to the original Greek, Luke uses the word to describe the building as kataluma. And the only other place that he uses kataluma in the entire his gospel describes the upper room or a guest room that was used by Jesus during the Last Supper. When he describes a true hotel, a true inn, such as in the story of the Good Samaritan, where the Good Samaritan takes the wounded man and takes him to an inn to be cared for, Luke uses the word pandokion, which actually means a true hotel. So all this that has come down to us, is that, this inn is really wrong. All it says is there was no room for him in the upper guest room. All right. Now, most 1st century, well, first of all, this is the cave of the purported birthplace of Jesus, this little room right in here. And opposite, back behind here, is this little spot, which is, you can see, highly venerated with all these censers and everything else. But this is what, outside of a courtyard house, and this is sort of a modified courtyard house, but many 1st century Jewish homes were 2-story affairs. And they may or may not have had this little courtyard area in here, but the cooking and animals brought in for storage at the, from wild animals or the cold at night was down on the first floor. And the family lived up on the second floor and up on the roof. And you can see the ladder going up there to on the roof. And in the summertime, people slept up on the roof because it was cooler. So when Luke describes that there was no room for them in the in the courtyard house with the upper guest room, he's saying that Joseph went to a relative in Bethlehem, but there were other people already visiting to be taxed, and they were occupying the upper room. So they stayed on the first floor down where the animals were. Okay, and that's where they were. So they weren't shuttled off to some, nothing little garage type apartment or something like that. They were in the house. They were just down on the first floor. All right, the next step in the Christmas story is the angel visiting the shepherds. And there were shepherds living out in the field nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. And an angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, "Don't be afraid. I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all people. Today in the city of David, a Savior has been born to you, and he is Christ the Lord. This will be a sign to you. You will find a babe wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger." All right. So let's take that. We've got shepherds out in some field. Well, just north of the Church of the Nativity, just north of modern day Bethlehem, there is a large open field that's known as Migdal Eder, which in Hebrew means the Tower of the Flock. This is the same field where tradition has it that Ruth and her mother-in-law came back from Moab, and she met Boaz, and they got married because it was Boaz's field. And of course, Ruth was the great grandmother of David, and in the lineage coming down, obviously through David, to both Joseph as well as Mary. During the 1st century AD, that field was tended by Levitical shepherds. And these shepherds specifically raised sheep that were designed for sacrifices in the temple. Bethlehem is about 5 miles south of Jerusalem. So this is where those sheep were being raised to be sent to the temple for sacrifice. So in the winter, when the lambs were being born, the shepherds would take them to just on a hill above that field where there's a large cave, and they would wrap them in swaddling clothes and keep them warm. Now, most of you may not have ever raised sheep. My father owned a small ranch in Central Texas, and we had about 1,800 sheep, and they invariably are born in the coldest night of the winter, and they're very wet, and they will freeze to death if they aren't swaddled and dried off, which I did as a young lad. So being told by the angel of the Lord that they would find God's Savior for all mankind wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in the manger would have had a very special meaning for them, because it would have implied to them that this was God's sacrifice for all of mankind, just like the sheep they were tending was that. This is the field at Migdal Eder. It's this large open field sitting here. It's probably several football fields in length. Interestingly, the first time I was in the Holy Land, we were standing up on this mountain you can see up here looking down at the field, and a shepherd came down with his sheep and started grazing in the field just like it happened 2,000 years ago. And up behind me where I'm taking this photograph is a large cave structure, which you can see here. And this is the cave that is traditionally related to the shepherds who were tending that field at Migdal Eder. And inside, there's a church today, but inside you can see the ceiling is just blackened with carbon fiber, all of which has been dated to the 1st century AD. Obviously, this was a place that they were bringing the newborn lambs in, taking care of them, and keeping everything warm in there. So that part of the story is also now supported. So the next part is Jerusalem. After the baby Jesus has been born, his parents take him to consecrate him at the temple. So they walk 5 miles from Bethlehem north to Jerusalem. And what the gospel says is, when the time of their purification according to the law of Moses had been completed, Joseph and Mary took him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord, as is written in the law of the Lord, that every firstborn male is to be consecrated to the Lord and to offer a sacrifice in keeping with what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of doves or 2 young pigeons. Now, that innocent little verse has a great deal of meaning to it. We learn 3 things from that. First of all, his parents were devout Jews who took the law of Moses seriously and made the journey to the temple to present their son to the Lord and offer purification sacrifices. The second thing is that Jesus was born into a relatively poor family, because the traditional sacrifice that is set out in Leviticus 12 calls for the family to give a year-old lamb, but only if the family could not afford a lamb could 2 birds, doves or pigeons, be substituted. So the fact that it mentions two birds indicates that Joseph was not overtly wealthy, and that's all they could afford. And the third part is the temple that was visited by Jesus there, and then later during his time, was the second, or Herod's temple. It's the Temple Mount that's preserved in Jerusalem today. And parts of that original 1st century AD temple are still in existence, primarily 2 parts. The first is the southern steps to the Temple Mount, or the steps of Huldah. And these are 30 steps. They're almost 200 feet across, and 30 steps would have come up to a gate, which is sealed today on the Temple Mount, but they would have come up to this gate. And that is probably the way that both Joseph and Mary brought Jesus up to the Temple Mount, as well as Jesus would have walked when he went to the temple as an adult. This is a model of the Second Temple, or Herod's temple, that's present at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. This is where I'm standing would have been the Mount of Olives. Facing east would have been the temple structure itself. This is the Golden Gate. Those steps that I just showed you would have been here on this side. Now, you'll note that the temple itself is built over a mountain called the Mount Moriah. And to create a level place up here for a temple to stand, Herod had a huge platform built of large stones that covered the top of the mountain as well as down the slopes of it, and that then created this flat platform on top for the temple to be placed on. The only part of that still survives is the western side of it. And this is the Western Wall, or what you've known as the Wailing Wall. Devout Jews come to it today and pray. This upper part up here is later Ottoman construction by the Ottoman Turks, but these large blocks right here are all from King Herod's time and the 1st century AD. Now, if you go to the left of this photo, there's a tunnel that goes down underneath, and you can see the true foundation of all these stones. And this is a picture of me by one of those stones. The stone I am touching, and it's this huge one that's pictured here, is called the Great Western Stone. And it is the largest stone. It's almost 45 feet long by 10 feet high. They don't really know how far it goes back in because it's obviously part of a wall. But it is estimated to weigh 570 tons. And to this day, no one really has a good understanding of how Herod's engineers were able to both move this stone and then slide it into place as part of the foundation of the wall. But where I am standing there in the left-hand photo is a pathway along the Temple Mount, and that is the pathway that Jesus and many others would have walked along the side of the Temple Mount. And the stonework that my feet are on there date to the 1st century AD. All right, the next part of the story is the Magi and King Herod. So what the gospel tells us is this, and this is from Matthew. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." And on coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they have bowed down and worshiped him. And then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. All right, so we've got three things here. We have a man named Herod, who is the king. We have Magi coming from the east. And then we have these gifts of three things. Well, first of all, Herod is known as Herod the Great. He ruled from 37 BC till his death, probably more like 1 BC, not 4. He's a well-known historical figure. There are many records of him, there are monuments to him, there are thousands of coins that bear his image, so that's not really in doubt. However, archaeologists have not found his tomb until very recently. And in 2007, a archaeologist from Hebrew University named Ehud Netzer believed he found the tomb of Herod. The body was not there, but his sarcophagus was there, and that and the other artifacts they excavated are now an exhibit in the Israel Museum. Now, where he found it was a place south of Bethlehem, so even further south, called the Herodium. Of course, Herod not being one to shy away from naming things after himself. But this area is flat. This thing that looks like a volcano is completely from the surface up man-made. And when you get to the top, it's hollowed out. And he built a palace inside of it. And there are 4 great towers here as watchtowers. You can see the steps leading up and down into it. And he had a royal palace there. He had baths with flowing water from huge water storage. Anyway, Netzer began excavating all around. He started down here. He thought the burial place might have been in these structures below, but he wound up on the side of the Herodium, and that's where he found this incredibly ornate carved sarcophagus. Now, most Jews were buried in a crypt, and then 12 months later, your relatives came back. They picked up your desiccated bones and put you in a small bone box called an ossuary that was like 2 feet long. And nobody was buried in this kind of sarcophagus. And it has these ornate carvings all over it and everything. And you can see it was smashed, deliberately broken later, probably in anger by some of the later Jews who never considered Herod the king of the Jews themselves, because he wasn't Jewish. He was actually Idumean, which is the people that live south of Israel. Any rate, that is the sarcophagus that's on display in the Israel Museum. So clearly, the first part of that, King Herod, no doubt he existed. Now, the term Magi translates to a host of things. It can mean wise men, teachers, priests, physicians, astrologers, interpreters of dreams, sorcerers, everything. The only thing it doesn't mean is kings. They were not rulers of any kind. So when we have the old hymn, "We Three Kings," that's false. They were not kings. And in fact, the number 3 is not mentioned in the Gospels either. The only thing that is mentioned are 3 gifts. And because there are 3 gifts, there is an assumption that there were three magi, magi being plural, of the word magnus, which is the word that we get today from, that means magic. So, you know, the odds that there were three, that comes from a Egyptian document from the 5th century AD and nothing before that. The Syrian Christian churches actually believe there were 12, corresponding to each of the 12 tribes of Israel. But we don't know. And the traditional names, Melchior, which is a Persian name, Gaspar or Caspar, which is Indian, and Balthazar, which is a Babylonian name, they also stem from a Egyptian document of the 5th century AD and nothing before that. Now, the three gifts, gold, these are well-known gifts to kings. Gold signified wealth, frankincense, a deity, especially a deity on earth, and myrrh was an anointing balm, both of kings being anointed and then at their death being preserved. And so these have long-standing historical significance, which I'll show you in just a second. The trade in these, though, was dominated by the Nabateans, who lived on the other side of the Dead Sea in what is now modern-day Jordan, in the city of Petra. And so what it means is these three men who came from the east probably crossed through Petra because it was the caravan route, and they probably purchased these three gifts there and then brought them on their trip to Jerusalem. The age of when they came, and we celebrated either they came at the time that Jesus was born or at Epiphany on January the 6th. But there's really nothing that supports that. Matthew repeatedly in this part of the story uses the word paidion to describe Jesus. And paidion in Greek doesn't mean a baby. It doesn't mean a young child. It means a toddler. And this may be the reason that Herod issues the command to have all the children under the age of 2 killed in Bethlehem and the surrounding area, which has come down to us as the slaughter of the innocents. But the reason that that 2 years was used is because probably Jesus was, you know, somewhere between, you know, 1 and 2 years old about this time. Now, the three gifts themselves. The first recorded instance of these three being given to a king was to the Greek king Seleucus II in Syria in 243 BC. And he then dedicated the three gifts to the god Apollo at a temple in Melias, there in on the southern coast of Turkey. Since that time, it became a recognized gift to all kings that they should receive these specific three gifts. So there is historical precedent for why these three gifts would have been included. And this, of course, is the fabled treasury building. It isn't a treasury, it's actually a tomb in Petra, but everyone recognizes it because this was the building used in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. But the whole camel caravan trade for those three gifts was funneled from the Arabian Peninsula with gold and then frankincense and myrrh to this area, and the Nabateans had an essential monopoly on it. All right, the last part of the holy story is the flight to Egypt. When they had gone, meaning the wise men had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child and kill him." So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night and left for Egypt, and where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled when the Lord had said through the prophet, Out of Egypt, I called my son. All right. We don't know where the Holy Family went to in Egypt. It's not said, just other than the country. However, it is probable that Joseph took his family to Heliopolis or near there. And the reason for that is there was a large community of Jews living in Heliopolis because of the presence of the Jewish temple of Onias. This was the second largest temple for the Jews anywhere else outside of Jerusalem. And it was built by both the Greeks and the Romans supported its building so that the Jews in Egypt could have a place to worship. And being devout Jews, which we have already seen, Joseph probably would have taken his family to a place where there were one other Jews and where they had the ability to worship God and make sacrifices to him. And lo and behold, if you go to Heliopolis today, there is still the remains of a very large Jewish temple of Onias. It is different in structure to the rectangular structure building in Jerusalem. It was actually more built kind of like a triangle with a pyramidic top. But nonetheless, it exists, and there are all kinds of records that this was worshipped at. The building itself existed from 173 BC to 73 AD, so for 243 years. And it was serviced by priests from the family of this man named Onias. And there are written records of Jews in that area coming to the temple to worship and making sacrifices to God. So what do you get from all of this? Well, what I take away from it is the Christmas story as it's depicted in the Gospels really is steeped in history. Many of the people, the places, the things that happen are all verified by archaeology, and much of it recently. Moreover, the writings of a number of ancient historians, Roman as well as Jewish, confirm that Jesus was a true historical figure. But none of what I've shown tonight or those records, proves the Bible. People in my class are always asking me to prove, everything in the Bible with archaeology, and you just can't do that. But it does show that the Bible is historically reliable when it describes the life and times of Jesus. But at the end of the day, belief in Jesus and the Bible always is a matter of faith. We live in a world that seeks proof beyond a shadow of a doubt. But Jesus, when he was here, said, believe. And for me, the truly good news of Christmas are the words of the angel given to the shepherds. For unto you a Savior has been born, and he is Christ the Lord. So with that, that is the end of my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it.